Collins & Co invite you to join us for our regular lunchtime not-for-profit seminars and workshops. In these sessions, guest speakers deliver expert knowledge on topics specifically catered for the not-for-profit sector. Sessions are held at Collins & Co from 12 till 2 and lunch is provided. Contact Collins & Co to find out the next seminar topic and to register.
Hi, I'm John Fergusson from Daymark. We're a reputation and issues management firm. I'm here today to talk about issues management and media management in times of crisis. I'm really hoping for a very interactive session. We've got a great group of people listed to come along. That one. So, tick, agenda number 1, item done. Thank you very much for that. I guess, and I think a lot of you have sort of almost said this in your intros, you know, crisis or issues, should I say, issues and crises, it's not if but when. So as I say there, sort of bad things happen to good companies and good organisations. So you really do need to prepare. And that's probably my underlying message for today is that when you're standing in front of a journalist on a doorstop, you hope that 95% of the work's been done either a month, 2 months, a year prior to that very daunting situation. So all of the people that you'd see in front of, you know, current affair and these sorts of things, the good performers and the good communicators have prepared for a long time to stand in front of that camera. Not that they wanted to do it, but that's how they've managed it. Sort of lifestyle of the life cycle of a crisis. Again, you know, 80% of crises are predictable. And I worked in the banking sector for a number of years, and it's sort of, I haven't been in there for 10 or so years now, but a lot of the issues that have come up through the Royal Commission, everyone knew about them at the time, you know, 10 years ago. And they were those issues where, you know, it was a combination. It was usually to do with sort of human motivation. It was either if you changed it, someone was going to lose some budget, which is pretty sad. If you changed it, that's just, why would we change it? Because it's what we've always done. But a lot of the issues that turn into crises, people know about well before they happen. So they have a gestation period. But as we say there's, you know, 80% predictable, 20% out of the blue, as a general rule. Again, you know, best practice is practice a lot. Process, so I'll take you through sort of some of the processes that you'd go through to develop a crisis management plan. People, so the sort of the role of the spokesperson. I've sort of rolled in there we do a bit of media training, so some of our sort of insights that we take people through who we are training to front the media. So hopefully you'll be able to take some sort of practical tips away from that. Some media insights themselves, and media, and by media I'm talking sort of social, digital, traditional, the whole gamut. But you know, it's changing massively on the day-to-day basis. And fundamentally it's changing where journalists are more time poor, under more pressure, and to a certain degree that means they don't have the time to sort of get the story right on the one hand, but they also need us as the inform and the spokespeople to make sure they do have the story right. So there's a sort of a double edge to that, some of it positive. And then just to finish off with a bit of a checklist and, you know, what good management looks like. So go into the not if but when. So this is just a collection of recent crises and they affect businesses across the board. You know, underpaying staff. It was probably an issue within the 7-Eleven network for many years before someone actually stood up and blew the whistle on them. You know, Telstra the same, Uber have gone through the same sort of things. So as you can see, it happens to lots of different companies and lots of different organisations on a day-to-day basis around a whole range of issues. This little guy down here, who's actually now, I think she's actually now a queen bee. They've changed the logo, which is a nice little tip to reality in the bee industry. But we've done a lot of work with Capilano over the last couple of months, and fair to say they have been, well, they've had a really tough time with the whole fake honey issues and sort of the Chinese imported honey aspects to it. And what that did sort of highlighted to us was these guys were well prepared, they thought, and they had their plans in place, and they practiced it, and they actually had some agitation over the last couple of years. So they actually had some practice to front this and to bat back issues and the like. Where they didn't quite get it right. We could have done a better job is probably around some of the roles of senior management in it. So you've got boards who have different agendas, you have board members who have different agendas, you have executives with different skills. So I think if they had their time again, and touch wood, they've had their time in the crises, and it is more recovery mode now, but I think they probably would have clarified the roles of board members and of senior management. So I guess what I'm saying there is you can have the best laid plans, but you've got to make sure that people understand their roles in those plans, and as happening here, the scenario testing is a really, really good way to shine a light on people who are really good at things and people who you expect to be really good at things and mightn't be as good as you think. So plans and testing, very important.
Can I just ask a question or a comment? Yeah, sure. Like all the examples that you've given there are corporate organisation, not necessarily not-for-profit. Are there any not-for-profit examples that?
Well, I think the one that comes to mind is the Oxfam issue, is a sexual harassment issue I can't remember the exact part of the world, but that was so I have got corporates here. I should say that is most of our work. We work for not-for-profits. So we are doing some work for Scope at the moment in this space. They're going through NDIS transition and also transitioning a lot of state government housing services over to them. So we're going through their entire sort of crisis and corporate planning process. We also do some work for St Kilda Housing, Community Housing, RMIT up in the Northern Territory, which is quite interesting work, which again has a geographic difference to issues management. So off the top of my head, I'm sorry to say that they're the only ones I can think of from a not-for-profit. Yeah, and maybe it is because I guess you sort of look at these sort of issue types, and I guess just thinking about the disability sector. There's any number of issues that can come up from that. I mean, there's a huge amount of issues, especially accommodation, treatment, the sort of the financial side of it. But I think that the not-for-profits, generally speaking, in my experience, are more responsible, more ethical than corporate. So maybe that's why I've got it there, or maybe that's just why we just went through and trawled through the corporates because they're the ones we're more familiar with. Yes, yeah, and that I guess that sort of comes into this sort of the sort of financial sort of poor service and the ethical side of things.
I was wondering, the issues that you've listed on the left side, would those be broadly the categories that most fall into?
Yes. Yeah, we'd say that is generally speaking the categories of issues that organisations will face. So again, this one is an interesting one, and I guess it does point to the question around being ready for an issue and a crisis, without going into the details of it. But this happened. It was as the coronial inquest is now sort of finding out, they were completely unprepared for this. They skimped on maintenance. But one of the things that really stood out for me, and it's something that I won't forget from an issues management point of view, is the CEO at the time was asked in a press conference whether how the family felt, the families of the victims felt, and then the journalist asked, "So have you spoken to any of the families?" And she hadn't spoken to any of the families, and it's that sort of they obviously hadn't prepared to think about the list of questions and I mean not even the list of questions, but their actual responsibilities in a sort of a duty of care point of view. So this is a sad, very sad situation where people have died and a company's been destroyed by being unprepared for crises. So this is I guess this is sort of a diagram of how a crisis develops, and this sort of goes back to what I was saying before, is that they have a gestation period. So there's sort of like these things bubble along and they might sort of pop up on a risk register or something like that. It says, well, that might be an issue, we better have a bit of a look at that. And there's a sort of timing here where they sort of do turn into a bit of an issue, but no one really does anything about it. And this next slide sort of gives you the sort of the more detail around it. So this is sort of where you guys are now in that risk identification, risk management sort of piece. What does our crisis management planning look like? Something might happen, something might go wrong that you've anticipated and you manage it, but it's probably not until there's a bit of media coverage where the magnitude of an issue turns into a crisis. So what we're saying, and I think a number of you are doing it, is this is the most important period, and if you can actually get this right, then you will manage it so it doesn't spike here and doesn't end up in the media. So as I said, our approach to sort of protecting reputation is that sort of 80% of our effort will go into that reputational risk identification and mitigation and all the communications processes around that, and then 20% of our effort will go into actually managing crises. So as it says at the bottom there, manage risks well, manage fewer crises. So I think that's a really important point. So if you can manage the issues well, you'll have fewer crises. So best practice in this space is characterised by that belief that it's not the touch wood I hope doesn't happen to us. It's going to happen to us. This is going to happen to us, so we need to prepare for something to go wrong and for us to be put through the ringer. So then therefore you need to sort of develop the crisis management. So the crisis management is one piece and the communications is another. So that's the planning, and that's actually the communicating of the issues around a crisis. Be very, very sort of sure of what the triggers are between sort of reputation and risk, issue and crises. So there'll be specific things that'll happen. You don't want it to get to the media. You want to be sort of alerted to it before then. So the crisis priorities are set according to the company's values. The role of the CEO or senior leadership is absolutely critical in a crisis. And we sort of talk about Andrew McKenzie here, who flew from wherever he was in the world to be at that Samarco issue. He fronted the media, he led it, he was in front of the media and in front of his people and in front of the families and everything. So senior leadership in the heart of a crisis is absolutely critical. And it's compared against the BP guy who sort of said he wanted his life back.
Sorry, can I just ask the second point, crisis management and communications must reflect the business? Sorry, I maybe missed what you said around that.
So it's I guess it's about, how do I describe this? So it's actually about, it's got to be, I guess, in the character of the business. Yep. So that's what it is. So you can't suddenly become something else. You're representing engineers in various parts of the developing world. You can't sort of appear to be a BHP or something like that. So it's important to be in character, if that makes sense. Yes. And that comes back to a lot of the spokesperson preparation that we do. We're not trying to make every spokesperson the most professional presenter in front of a camera or anything like that. We're actually trying to make them the most authentic they can be, because that's what people watching it see and feel, and so that's a really important part of it. I guess this last point, and I think Elizabeth sort of said this before, but initial communication to the media has to be absolutely as soon as possible. It's with social media and digital media, it is minutes, not hours. And the more that you dilly-dally around sort of the words of a media release or the words of a spokesperson, you are every second you are getting behind the 8 ball and having to answer the agenda of the other side. So in this situation, if something went wrong for a client of ours who happens to be in disability services, we would make sure that the CEO is out there saying, we acknowledge something's gone wrong, and some of the techniques we use is sort of the AAA sort of technique, which is sort of acknowledge there's been something wrong, apologise, and action. So the CEO could stand up and say, we acknowledge there's been an issue in such and such a house. We apologise to anyone who's been affected by this, and what we are doing about this is there's an immediate investigation, or we're working with emergency services or whatever it is. So it's quite simple. So you don't have to go out there and give chapter and verse about the detail of the issue and what's happened. It's making sure you get in front of the media as soon as possible. And that quote at the bottom, again, is pretty consistent with what I'm talking about, but it's those proactive mechanisms that have been tested and revised over time. So the scenario testing is invaluable. So this is sort of the aims of the crisis. So normal business is, there's little issues that bump up and down and, you go on with life. A crisis hits, and what happens is suddenly there's this massive, from business as usual down here to height of crisis. And if you're not prepared for it, the chances are that crisis will bump on, and we've seen that in the dream world situation where it's 3 years later, nearly 2.5, 3 years later, and that crisis is still noticed on page 3 of the papers today. So the idea is to get business or organisation back to business as usual as soon as possible. So we sort of say that if you're prepared and trained, that you can, crisis hits, it's going to hurt for a while, but you can maybe minimise the impact on your reputation, and then you can work hard to bring the business back to normal. So that's the general aim of good crisis management. So this is just talking about sort of the process of crisis management planning. So the objectives are to, as we said, to ensure the leaders in the business understand when an issue or an incident becomes a crisis. You see this a fair bit actually, and a client in the manufacturing sector recently, they had an issue with, it was fundamentally with us, it was a systems issue that went wrong. So a large, Fujitsu, who were managing their customer relations system went down. The business knew about it, and they just didn't see it as a major issue in the early stages. But what actually ended up happening was that it basically almost ground the business to a halt because their customers couldn't order from them, nor could they fulfil the customer orders. So again, there's things in your organisations where you go, this just feels like this is a bit bigger than what the CEO is thinking, or senior management, or you're thinking as the senior leaders. So again, that goes back to some of the planning. If you can go in there and say, we think this is the myriad of issues that are going to affect our organisation, and these are the most serious ones, these are the medium, and these are the less serious. So you can actually prepare a lot for that situation. So again, it's just making sure you understand when an issue becomes a crisis. And the second point there is really, making sure the business returns to a state, from a state of crisis to normality as soon as possible. To give staff and external stakeholders confidence that the organisation is dealing with the crisis well, to ensure the health and environmental regulatory agencies, so that's your broader stakeholder groups, are all informed of the current situation. Define pre-appointed team, massively important to have that as part of your crisis. Preparedness is having a crisis management team who, usually involves a COO, a CEO, senior operations, may involve legal, may involve HR, depending on the nature of the organisation. But has those people, and they know their roles and responsibilities. They are part of the crisis management team. So to give practical guidance, so during crises, good crisis management will give practical guidance to those people managing it, and to ensure your reputation is maintained. So that's, I guess, is the fundamental objective of a good crisis management plan. Again, we won't go through all of these, but standard crisis management, a crisis management plan is a sort of a standard tool for businesses and organisations of any size, I think. Crisis management structure to an otherwise unstructured. So it gives structure to a really emotional thing. One of the things we'll sort of say, and I, for my sins, was the communications person for the Mikey transport ticketing system. So we had a few issues along the way. And I worked for the private contractor who built and operated the system. But what we did with the government very early on was work out a process of communication. And the objective of that was all of these things, all the things that we've been talking about, but it was fundamentally to take the emotion out of it. So, because between contractor, government, transport user, media. There's always pressures that just fly everywhere. So one of the fundamental learnings I got out of that was to develop a process and give roles to people where no matter what the content of the situation, we managed it according to process. So we had a period in early 2010 where I'd wake at 5 a.m. to Rob Curtin from 3AW, do a news grab at 3AW about, my favourite was the jackpot issue when you put your card at the machine and the balance said $473,000, something like that. So we called it the jackpot issue, but you know. So there was issues that ran day to day for probably 6 months, and you get to a point where everyone just goes, right, okay, I know what I'd have to do, bang, 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 do this, do that. I'm the spokesperson, I developed the messaging, you know. So I think that's really important to highlight, is that the process you develop takes the emotion out of the issue. And a lot of the organisations you guys work with have sort of high emotional content. You know, these are, you know, either vulnerable people or people doing, you know, jobs in dangerous situations. And the people who are managing it need to be very structured and following the process. So I guess without going through all of those sorts of things, but you know, it's the tested side of things. It's giving clients and regulators comfort, gives comfort to bankers. Legal and, you know, insurance policies sometimes depend on you having one. I don't know whether, does anyone have that as part of their insurance situation where they actually have to have a crisis management plan? They test it and stuff. It's becoming more and more prevalent where insurance companies will say, we'll insure you, but you must have a crisis management plan and you must have tested it over a period of time. So it's all about reducing risk and protecting your reputation. So the channel, the media, which is, I guess, you know, which was a main part of the heading today, but what I wanted to do was to really emphasise that, you know, the media is only actually quite a small part of crisis management and communication. You know, most of the work is done prior to you fronting the media. So this is just a disability services sort of some of the issues. So you can see that, you know, it's sort of, you know, these are awful stories about, you know, NDIS and answering reforms that advocates warn people not consulted. Disability service provider receives $110,000 for new model. You know, people with, you know, it's a sort of, the headlines are so sort of emotional and attention grabbing. And just as an aside to that, and this actually relates directly to St Kilda Community Housing, we announced with Shane Austin, who's the CEO, and the Minister on last Thursday that St Kilda Community Housing was going to upgrade one of its rooming houses in St Kilda, and it's sort of in a notorious little spot of St Kilda called the Little Grey Street Strip, and it's been well run, but it needs upgrade. So the objective of the communications was very much to sort of communicate that we hadn't been closed down by government as other providers in the area had been previously. That this was part of a proactive refurbishment and upgrading of rooming facilities for vulnerable people. The body of the story that I think it runs today but came up online last week was fantastic. Yep, this is all part of it. The headline, another disgraceful rooming house closed down. So you can see how, and what happens, and this comes back to some of the media, the cost pressures on media, is that the story is written by a journalist and then that's given to a sub-editor who then looks at it and goes, well, I've got to make something sensational about this, got to grab, so they just pull a line out of it and pop it, or otherwise refer to previous articles. And so again, it's sometimes hard to control exactly what's written, but the best laid plans can sometimes not work out 100%.
In that instance, that's not a reputational risk to the organisation. It's a political headline. Yeah. So, you know, the issue, it's not exactly a crisis, but the issue doesn't actually lie with the organisation, but it's kind of political mileage.
But it rubs off
which
the
probably,
organisation.
well, maybe it's to the advantage of the organisation highlighting the issue around housing. So some of those things.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point.
There's pluses and minuses actually of some of that negative publicity.
Yeah. I think that you make a really good point, which reminds me, the other important thing to sort of is the media is it can be a very, very valuable way to communicate a position. So everyone is naturally sort of a little bit sort of apprehensive about it, but I'd encourage you to look at it, and this is hard when you're in the middle of an issue or a crisis, to have a look on the other side of the coin and say, so how do we use this situation to better position our organisation and build our reputation? I was just saying before that sometimes the content of an issue, people will forgive you for the content, but they won't forgive you for how you've managed it. So it sounds weird, but sometimes the management of an issue, and if an organisation manages a really bad issue really well, then the reputation of that organisation is probably going to recover quicker than a bad issue or bad crises plus bad management. So there is a way to sort of use the media in that way. So this is just a sort of a grab bag of social affairs writers. This is and journalists around the country who will pick up social issues and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of them, and I guess this is just to let you know that some of them are joined. So a story in the Age will probably end up in the Fin Review or the Herald Sun, or an Australian article might flip into the Herald Sun. Then there's the sort of the online versions of news.com.au, which goes global. But there's a lot of journalists to keep in mind when the proverbial hits the fan. And I guess what I'm saying there too is that a point there is that you don't have to go to them all, and this might be part of your sort of strategy development phase, is to say, so who do we think are the most important journalists, media in our space, and that really comes back to who your audience is in those sorts of situations. It might be. I'll go back to my time at the bank at the NAB. We used to read about restructures in the Financial Review, and we used to call the Financial Review the NAB newsletter. So, so the news would go to the Fin Review, and then that'd be a good way to sort of inform staff around what was happening, but not necessarily the best way to do things. But yeah, so the point there is have a think about the style of journalists and what they do, and pick and choose them. So you've got like Raph Epstein on Drive on ABC, very in tune with social issues, not a hard edge, sort of shock jock style radio reporter. But then you go down to like Aisha Dow. I don't know whether she's still in that role, but relatively young journalist, but is just hard at it, looking for the negative side of things. So get an understanding of your media. I guess what it's saying. So some of the things that are happening in media, which again is part of your thought process as far as the planning goes. So the trends are focused on digital. So all of the papers have their digital versions. I did a day in the Fairfax newsroom in Sydney, and it is completely bizarre. It looks like an old-fashioned stockbroking. The floor of a stockbroking. They're all in a circle around this central area that basically has a whole range of televisions, and you'd see this when you go into the digital versions of the SMH or the Age or something, that the headlines, the stories move and change, and they are moving and changing as people click on them. So every story is rated in real time, and the higher the rating on each story, the higher it moves up on the front page, or then it moves up to the second story or the third story, whatever it is. So these newsrooms are so focused on digital, and they're all focused on clicks. It's who's doing what. Whereas in the old days, you'd get a front page, and probably the most senior journalist would get the biggest story, and that'd sit there, and the next day another paper would come out. These things are moving on a day-to-day basis. So that's how stories develop over time, and in quick time. And this is the sort of the next point, sort of the never-ending story. So a journalist will get up, sort of, my family's fascination with a certain English family, the baby news of Harry and Meghan. The first piece of that would have been a line in every media outlet that says she's pregnant, and then the next 5 minutes that they'd be developing, that story. So an issue or crisis story can start with that first line, and this is where it's really important that your organisations are on the front foot and out there communicating your position on the issue, doing the right thing, acknowledging, apologising and saying what you're doing about it really early, so the story's built from your position and not from someone else's position who's on the spot. Niche audiences, again, this is really quite pertinent for the not-for-profit sector. Is really understanding the journalists who understand your sector, have a certain style about them, and have a certain reach towards the audiences you want to communicate with. Journalists, time poor. So we've got a couple of journalists who work for us, and Sarah would be in her mid-30s. When she was at the Canberra Times, she would write a story, maybe 2 a day. When she left the Canberra Times 5 years later, she was writing 5 stories a day. So they're basically sitting at their desk churning out stories, whereas previously they were out there talking to people and understanding issues. So a lot of the time the journalists, even though they might have an understanding of your sector, have got 4 other stories to run the day. So again, there's an opportunity for us there to make sure they have the right information from your organisation's point of view, and then they can write from that point of view. And sometimes from a more proactive point of view, it might be that you say, okay, there's 4 or 5 journalists around the state or whatever it might be, who we think are sort of understanding of our issues in our sector and that sort of thing. Proactively engage with them, meet with them for a coffee, ring them up, have a conversation with them, ask them. I mean, again, I'm sort of going against their time poor, but every now and again they'll agree to catch up. If you can develop relationships directly with those 3 to 5 journalists or whatever it is, if and when an issue comes up, they're more than likely to understand your position, your organisation's position on it, and also, respond in a relatively favourable way. More content, less news. Just sort of talked about that one. So they're under massive amounts of pressure. There's fewer of them and more stories that have to be churned out. And this last point, success, is measured on clicks, which is very different to what it used to be not that long ago. So this is to the point. So this is one of my favourites because but this slide's just really just an illustration of that. So what the media is looking for is the thing. So that's what the editor, the pick editor or the editor will ask. So what's the thing? And the thing is, what's the really news grabby piece of this? So it might be, dare I say it, in social housing, it's someone bent over, injecting their arm with heroin or something like that. So they're after the thing. Again, if we flip that on the other side, what sort of pictures can we give them that positions us in the most positive light? So but they're still after that sort of thing. So that's just funny, I reckon, about him. Not a huge fan. But then this one's a classic of this sort of old style journalism, and then online that got 9,000 clicks per hour, and then they basically changed the story and just had a pic of a young woman, personalised it, and same stories, 20,000 clicks, so it's double. So again, they're looking for that sort of emotional angle. So people, this is all about, I guess some thoughts about how spokespeople can, perform, I guess is probably the best way to put it, communicate around issues and crises. And it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, that this sort of authenticity piece. So they've got to be themselves. So in your preparation for crises and your training of if you are the spokesperson, you've got to practice in front of a camera. I'm usually on the other side of the camera, so I'm quite, it's unusual for me to be standing here. But you want people to be themselves. And because if you can get your spokespeople to be themselves when they're explaining difficult things, then that comes through. It's a really, really strong way to communicate. So authenticity, they've got to have a level of enthusiasm is probably the wrong word in the issues in crisis management, but an understanding of it and a feeling for it. Clarity, they've got to speak clearly, nice short sentences, and this level of confidence that sort of exudes that they are under control. This is a terrible situation and they're doing everything they can to control it. Connection, so Again, there's some techniques you can sort of teach people in front of a camera. You don't look down the barrel of the camera, you look at the cameraman's ear, and if you get asked a question from over here, you still look at the cameraman's ear, same over there, because you're actually communicating with someone on the other end of that camera. And if you're doing this and answering a question there and answering a question there, you look a bit dodgy, and you're not solid on your feet. So there's a whole range of techniques, and you have a look over the next few days, and you'll sort of see people who do it well, and you'll see people who sort of don't do it well, and just gauge your own feeling as to how that communication came across. And this control piece, again, that's sort of a part of training, but it's actually the spokesperson, and this is journalists, politicians do it to a painful level. They have three main messages, and they just keep going back to one of those bridging messages. And we certainly don't suggest that, because you are being authentic, you're being sort of caring, you're being everything. But you do need to be, and we sort of say you should try and be a spokesperson, not an answer person. So you get asked a question, can you guarantee me that this will never happen again? What I can guarantee you is that we are doing everything we can to make sure the situation is managed in the best possible way in the interests of the people who have been impacted. So journalists will continue to ask those questions, those sort of yes or no questions, to try and sort of get you on that. So this just sort of comes back to that point before. People will forgive a leader who compromises their trust because of a lack of competence, stuff up, but they won't forgive someone who lies. They'll never forgive someone who bullshits. And that's this point up here is just sort of a survey of people saying that 86% of people say authenticity and the style of the person fronting the camera or interviewing is the most important thing. These are just some tips we give to people who are going through media training or likely to front the media. This one's a classic, because what we do in normal life, so we're sitting having a conversation here before, and if we sat there and I said to Elizabeth, so what do you think about this? And then you answered the question and I just sort of sat there and didn't respond, you would feel the need to fill the gap, fill the void. And it's sort of a polite thing to do, because you're having a conversation with someone. Journalists do it deliberately. So John Fane does it very well. He'll ask a question, they'll answer the question, and then he'll sort of, and you can feel it, building up in everyone. And we'll sort of say to the people who are being interviewed, just let it go. Because what he's trying to do is for you then to over-answer and to give more and those sorts of things. So there's a whole range of things that journalists do. I'm just trying to find a couple of other ones. Yes, the speculation one is, can you guarantee, or, I can't speculate. The yes or no questions, knowledge gap. Again, journalists will ask people a whole series of questions around stuff that they may or may not know much about. It's fine for you to say, or for your spokesperson to say, well, I don't know, but I can come back to you. It's better to say that than to answer it in an incorrect way. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, the off the topic, the interjection. That's one that I love. And listen to, if you get a chance to listen to talkback radio in the morning, and you'll hear particularly, that Neil Mitchell is a real pain with this. He'll interject halfway through answers, and consistently interject. And what he's trying to do there is to basically, put the person who's been interviewed off their guard. And it's really hard not to get pissed off with him, because you're not letting me answer the question. So again, what they're trying to do is that they interject, and the other thing they'll do, again, have a listen for this, but they up and they bring the speed of their speaking up and down. So they'll up the sort of the emotional side of their language. So we encourage clients to just, where possible, stay very nice and calm, and don't sort of up the meter of their conversation with the meter of the person who's interviewing them. So we had a classic example of...
They tend to do that with emotive language as well. When that goes up, the emotive language also increases.
Yeah, so it's sort of accusations around duty of care and can you believe this happens, or is it something, would you, what if this happened to your daughter or your mother or something like that? We did some work with the through the North Richmond Community Health Service with the medically supervised injecting room, and the guy who's the medical director there is a medical doctor, and he has this beautiful tone about him. He's just so relaxed, and he's been interviewed by everyone, and the issues around medical, safe injecting, and the illegality of illegal drugs and how the government's basically funding these people to give them a spot to do it and all that sort of thing. And he has this lovely sort of this tone of voice, and his responses are quite methodical. And he'll come out of an interview and he'll say, "Oh God, I'm so boring." And oh my God, Nico, that is just perfect, because that's exactly the type of person you need for a very, very emotive. Like, there's so many issues with that topic that you can't count them, but you get the right person presenting themselves in an authentic way. And Fane and other sort of shock jocks have tried in the past, but he doesn't get flapped. He's very relaxed. So anyway, these are just some examples of some of the techniques that the interviewers can use, and some of the techniques that your spokespeople can use to manage them. So I guess what I was wanting to do with this presentation is to say to you, the media is at a certain part of a crisis management. Most of your work will be done before you're ever in that situation. That if I was you guys, I'd be concentrating on the process, so the plan and the communications processes around it, and also the people. So how your people will manage it. I've focused on the person who's standing in front of the camera or doing the interviews or fronting up to the Senate committee. But it's just as important to have the broader group of people who manage the crises to be prepared and understand their role. Because on a longer term crises, and these may or may not, hopefully won't happen to your organisations, but you can't just have one spokesperson, because that spokesperson is going to basically fall over after a week of, or 3 days of being in front of the media. So again, you've got to sort of plan ahead and say, okay, if this issue goes for more than a day, do we have an alternate to the spokesperson? Do we have an alternate to the chair of the crisis management committee? So each one of those people should have alternates that can readily step up and be a part of the response and the recovery process. So just to sort of finish off here, and I guess this is what we'll say to our clients, is a good management of crises and issues, and therefore fronting the media will sort of, stop this issues rush where things just absolutely take off. Will give direction and permits leadership to occur, so people know their roles, they've practiced it. You identify the appropriate team members, and again, through scenario testing, you might get the point where you do find that there's someone who is really good at a particular role in a crisis management team that you wouldn't have expected, or someone's actually a really good presenter or spokesperson that you wouldn't have expected. So I think that testing aspect's important. So again, sort of helps identify priorities. One of the things that does happen in sort of crises is that there's such an upheaval for the organisation that everyone feels like they should get involved. So you end up with, half the board there, and you've got the CEO, and you've got, suddenly there's a business or organisation over here that still needs to be run. So it's really important for your planning part to actually realise that you actually only need a focus group of a number of people, and depending on the size of the organisation, that might be 4, it might be 6, who are at the core of it and need to know everything. And are the ones communicating up and down the line and all those sorts of things. Because otherwise, you can get the whole shooting match, the whole organisation suddenly trying to manage a crisis, and particularly with board members, I think they're experts at this sort of thing. Pleasure. Thank you.